Welcome, and happy Valentine's Day. I'm Bill Scheuerle, Director of the Humanities Institute. The Institute tries to show the talents of the professors in humanities. And we have different types of programs to do that. One type today is called a main event. A main event is an event dealing with a faculty member who has recently published a new book in the humanities. And the professor will come in and talk about that book. Our professor today is not really just a professor. He's a distinguished university professor. Distinguished university professor of French, Francophone literature in the Department of Modern Languages. World Languages. It's changed its name a long time ago. Professor Brulotte is a very impressive faculty member. I could probably spend an hour just going over his vita. I'm not going to do that, though. I have summarized. Maybe I'm part mathematician. He has published 6 journal publications, 18 books and monographs. He has also published 15 book chapters and episodes in books. So that comes up to almost 40 individual contributions to international scholarship. He has received many, many awards and numerous, really numerous, guest speaking engagements. This semester, we have 2 great opportunities to be with Professor Brulotte today, and also from March 28th, 29th, he is heading a conference which is going to be held on campus. It is a conference on the state of taste, T-A-S-T-E, with international scholars, national scholars, local scholars, who will be discussing different aspects of taste. There'll be more information about this later, probably next month. So it's my pleasure today to hear him talk about his 2-volume co-edited edition, the Encyclopedia of Erotic Literature, which contains 1,758 pages. Tom.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to the Humanities Institute for organizing this event, and thanks for coming over. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you on this rather unconventional subject, which is erotic literature, but it seems that it is perfectly fitting today's day. It is Valentine's Day, as you know. With some 4,000 years in age to its credit, if we go back as far as its Sumerian origin in 2200 before Christ, erotic literature is probably the genre with the longest historical life, and is as almost old as the history of writing itself. This is despite sustained censorship and repeated massive destruction of works from time to time. This resilient literature survived the 2 dynasties, monarchies, invasions, pillagers, wars, great epidemics, destructive religious inquisitions, genocides, revolutions, colonizations, dictatorships, totalitarian societies, including the most severe theocracies. So as an historian pointed out, it particularly flourished at peaks of civilization at its most sophisticated and refined times. So it is this extremely resilient genre that we thought, my British colleague John Phillips and I, deserved to be critically explored and better known to readers and the scholarly world. And this hence this encyclopedic work that we have published at Routledge, a well-regarded academic publisher, as you know, based in New York City and London. It presents a synthesis of what has been written on the subject from all angles and represents what we consider to be a unique tool of research and reference in the field for all those involved in teaching literature or researching it and its history, as well as the serious general reader, of course. 20th century French essayist Georges Bataille established that sexuality was the major problem of mankind, and no one else made it such than ourselves. As a significant cultural phenomenon, sexuality and its literary representation have become, as you know, an emerging area of study in the humanities over the last 100 years, from Freud to Barthes and Foucault and beyond. This reference work comes in the path of that research trend and relates to current events and concerns such as the worldwide development of new historicism, which is revisiting history, including the history of literature with its mechanism of inclusion and exclusion, and the history of mentalities and of such notions as love and intimacy as they have evolved through the centuries. And this interest is testified to by recent publishing successes that you must certainly have heard of, such as the history of beauty and the history of the body in France and Italy, one of them being by Umberto Eco. Our encyclopedia also relates to ongoing debates about censorship, cultural differences in the area of sexuality, and the representation of sex in literature, as well as to the postmodern movement away from fixed eternal verities to relativity and plurality in the field of ideas and the perception of behavior. What makes this encyclopedia stands apart is that most existing reference works on the subject are bibliographies and ontologies with short presentations of excerpts. This is an encyclopedia in the strict sense of the word, giving a comprehensive and discursive description and analysis of those innumerable works written in many different languages throughout our known history from ancient to modern times, and which are devoted to sex talk. It incorporates all literary traditions and genres, narratives, poetry, drama, some Eastern forms, essays, autobiographies, treatises, sex manual, etc. To achieve this mega project, it took 6 years of collective research involving over 400 contributors and the best scholars and advisors in the field from all over the globe and from diverse universities such as Oxford, Cambridge, London, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, including USF. The result, well, you see them here. These 2 volumes, as Bill mentioned, over 1,700 pages, over 440 entries, and as it was turning out at one point, the project was to be 1.25 million words and 3 volumes long, while our contract was in fact for a much shorter 1-volume book. So it was the publisher has his hair raising over his head. So we came to a compromise with the publisher and found the right balance to reduce the number of entries to fit in a 2-volume without sacrificing too much on the schedule and on the quality of contents. Entries are A to Z essays and range in length from 1,000 words to 8,000 words according to their importance. Each entry is accompanied by further reading, and in the case of authors' entries, selected works. The encyclopedia is fully cross-referenced at the end with a comprehensive index. So by proposing to the readers this reference work, we hope that they discover or rediscover how this literature has developed original human ways to give more meaning to an activity that is fundamentally functional and symbolically poor elsewhere in the so-called natural world. As we all know, passionate love and eroticism are not a natural given of the human condition. They are a cultural construction that has appeared in the early stages of civilization and has evolved over time. Throughout history, sex stories undoubtedly created enduring myths that were among the great seminal ideas of world literature and art. Let us think only of gods and goddesses, of mythologies, of legendary figures, or original characters such as the Japanese Genji or Yonosuke, or the Spanish and French Don Juan, the Italian Casanova, the French Nana, to name just a few. Most culture at one time or another viewed passion and sexual bonds as a threat to the social, political, and religious order. Perceived as suspects, they were harshly controlled. Even today, in what we could perceive as the generally more educated world that we're living in, sex stories continue to have strong enemies in both political and religious authorities. They are still censored in many cultures, including the Islamic world and a totalitarian countries such as Communist China. Nevertheless, erotic literature proved to be notoriously difficult to control and silence, hence its tenacious longevity for so many millennia. After this very general introduction, I would like to share with you some of the problems that we have encountered in the making of this book. And at the very start, the question that comes immediately to mind is, what do you mean by erotic literature? What is erotic literature and what is not? When consulting existing scholarly works on the subject and the very few specialized history of the genre, one is struck by the difficulties scholars have encountered in differentiating erotic literature from pornography or even from love stories containing strong passion and erotic passages. In fact, the word pornography derived from the ancient Greek pornographos, which bore little relation to our contemporary notion of pornography, since it merely denoted a type of biography, the lives of the courtesans, which was not necessarily obscene in content. The word pornographer, pornographe, reappeared in French during the 18th century with Restif de la Bretonne. It referred then to a similar erudite activity, a pornographer being the author of a treatise or study on prostitution. So it was not only until the 19th century that the definition of the word was widened to include the expression or suggestion of obscene or unchaste subjects in literature or art, and began therefore to assume a pejorative meaning within the Puritan context of the time. In modern usage, it encompasses any literary or visual materials designed to stimulate sexual feelings and presumably desires in its audience. Over time, the term shifted its own meaning to reflect changing mentalities and signification of the erotic. Today, the word seems to have broadened its meaning well beyond sexual explicitness to describe the violation of the dignified human body in a variety of contexts, including both aesthetic and political ones. The Holocaust, for example, is now what some call the modern pornography. We have an entry on pornography in this reference book, which was written by an American specialist from the American Viewpoint, and in which he confirms that there is no unified definition, and that the term has been a troubled concept and accordingly a troublesome term, especially in the last century. So neither of the existing terms, erotic or pornographic, is neutral, of course. But generally speaking, the former, that is erotic, is usually taken to refer to an acceptable form of sexual representation, while the latter, pornographic, designates a trashier form that is socially and politically less acceptable. Both terms are therefore tainted with a degree of judgmentalism, and the distinction between them depends on arguments and stereotypes that are fundamentally subjective, as well as culturally and temporally relative. I would like to review some of these arguments very briefly, hoping to show you one of the major problems we face and to clarify why we have elected the term erotic literature as the best inclusive term for the purpose of this reference enterprise. The psychological viewpoint, which is wholly related to readers' response. According to this viewpoint, what is erotic is what arouses the individual reader, while pornography does not. But obviously, it can go the other way around as well, as we have just seen, and actually, the Webster English Dictionary defines pornography as writings, pictures intended to arouse sexual desire. So we have found this psychologically based distinction rather irrelevant and confusing. Homosexual literature, for instance, will not arouse everyone, but is part of what we call erotic literature. Literary depictions of necrophilia may be repulsive to most readers, including myself, but belong to the erotic tradition. Erotic literature includes for us all types of sexualities. Indeed, many erotic texts do not seek to arouse at all. For instance, sexual prowesses are so unreal that no one can think of imitating them. Also, it is quite common for those texts to address explicitly and abruptly the reader to attract his or her attention on the act of writing in progress, judging their character, discrediting their own narrative, etc. So one consequence of this technique is that it breaks, of course, the fiction illusion and prevents all readers' identification with the character, which is so important in the so-called arousal process. In short, the psychological perspective does not help that much in defining clearly the genres. Another perspective is sociological in nature, and it defines eroticism as the pornography of the dominant social class. In this view, eroticism has aristocratic associations, while pornography is a lower class activity. Thus, pornography, but not eroticism, may represent a threat to the social order. Yet, as numerous entries demonstrate in our Encyclopedia, the eroticism of high literature is just as capable of subversion as more popular forms of writing about sex. For example, extremely refined libertine works by philosophers from the French Enlightenment period arguably helped to pave the way for the French Revolution. Throughout history, in fact, erotic writings in general can be said to have had a socially leveling influence. The sociological argument, therefore, does not really clarify the distinction either. Another argument and spurious yardstick is the gender of the author, by which pornography and eroticism distinction is sometimes measured. In this perspective, men produce pornography, of course, while women write the erotic. That's another stereotype, of course. This argument falters when confronted with anonymity and the extensive use of pseudonyms in this genre, and what we are to think of the many sexual confessions by women in contemporary cultures such as France, where it's a huge cultural phenomenon, and that are as explicit as anything uttered by men, even more so. These women are redefining sexuality in a manner that challenges gender stereotypes. So we have in our reference work long entries on this issue, on gender, lesbian literature, on women's writing as well, in the United Kingdom, France, Latin America, the USA, Spain, Costa Rica, Argentina, Algeria, Austria, etc. These entries clearly show women's aggressive presence in a field that once everyone thought was dominated by men. We also have an entry on the feminist perspective by a Canadian feminist who presents a balanced view of all sides, pro-censorship and pro-porn, as they call themselves. So in short, while we have respected how writers define their work themselves, we have elected not to use gender as a reliable source to justify a distinction between the pornographic and the erotic. Erotic literature for us includes both male and female authors. Finally, the aesthetic argument. That's a point of view that is often used to justify the distinction between erotic literature and pornography. That is what is artful and what is not. This perspective is important and certainly legitimate, as each culture determines for its own time what is art and what is not or can't be, what is stylish and what, as opposed to trash, what difference there is between literature and para-literature. The problem is that this definition tends to depend on aesthetic norms which vary from culture to culture and from period to period. Obviously, it's most useful to distinguish quality works from those who are bad, and often the word pornography is a downgrading word used for such poor quality works. But in literary theory, is there such a thing as a literary genre named bad novels? As a writer, I can say today, well, today I'm going to be writing a bad novel. So the general term of the genre is obviously novel, within which there can be bad works and good ones. And the same goes with erotic literature. Further, more importantly, numerous works which are considered masterpieces today were perceived and judged as pornographic by the censors of their time. How many of us would consider today the Dangerous Liaison by Laclos, or Flaubert's Madame Bovary, or Baudelaire's poems The Flowers of Evils, or D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lovers as pornographic works nowadays and threat to public morals? It seems it even seems today totally absurd that they may have been considered pornographic works at one time, but they were. So what was perceived as pornography at one point in time is no longer so. Such aesthetic judgments mixed with moral and religious preoccupations are very relative to space and time. These controversial works help nevertheless reshape the history of literature, since they broke the rules and forced the public taste to change. From a literary or aesthetic standpoint, some erotic works may use crude language, some not. I prefer these ones myself, but it's just a question of personal preference. Some are really poor quality works, while others are literary masterpieces. Personally, I prefer literary masterpieces, of course. But then both are still part of erotic literature, as bad novels are still novels. We have tried to be as inclusive as possible, as an encyclopedic work should tend to be by definition. Let's also point out that the word pornography does not even exist in all languages. In Farsi, for example, I'm told. And as our encyclopedia is distributed all over the world, it was important to use a title that would speak to the mind of all readers globally, while representing accurately its subject. Finally, a mix of aesthetic and moral criteria is used to define obscenity in order to establish legal classifications, which again vary from one culture to another. These definitions are most of the time very general and rather tautological in nature. Indeed, throughout the history of censorship, the word pornography more or less defines an obscene word that can offend. Sometimes definitions are adding some more precision, such as works that disturb the moral and social order, or which lack serious literary, philosophical, or scientific values. In fact, censors have sometimes used the notion of obscenity to devaluate or even ignore the literary qualities of works. The famous literary example that I've just given a few seconds ago are telling in this regard. Like literary critics, censors and legislators have to face the evolution of mores, as well as the conceptual indetermination of the rapid slippages of the notion of pornography. So in view of these slippages concerning the definition of pornography versus erotic, we have disregarded this problematic distinction, at least in the title and the global vision of the project. On this important issue, we are in sync with all major scholars in the field, who between the two terms have elected the term erotic as benefiting of a more stable meaning throughout history, and as being the most inclusive of the variety of works this encyclopedia covers. Consequently, the decision was taken at an early stage to discourage on the part of contributors the use of pornography and obscenity as terms most likely to convey negative impressions, and thus they are employed sparingly, where appropriate, and always within a clear historical and cultural context. Once the question of definition was more or less resolved, we had to face another major difficulty concerning the conceptual framework and the general organization of the future contents prior to its redistribution in alphabetical order. This is the second step that we needed to go through, that is to establish a sound list of entries, and we came up with over 1,000 entries. and we soon had to reduce it to less than 600 at the request of the publisher, and that's what we have now. We have less than 600. So we have divided them into 4 categories: historical overviews, topics and themes, literary surveys, writers, and works. I'll be commenting on these in a few minutes. Then we have created a team of reputed advisors, and we spent some time integrating their inputs. We created sample entries for contributors, to look at and have some a referential point, some form of anchorage, and we posted them on a website entirely devoted to this project, which helped tremendously. Only afterwards were we able to search for contributors worldwide, which was a major undertaking. We had to read and evaluate hundreds of Vedas before assigning entries. And for the most part, the project was done by email, with a few meetings here in Tampa for the conceptual part, or in London and New York for the assignment rounds of entries. To each selected contributor, a contract was sent out with a defined assignment and a deadline to meet. At one time, my co-editor and I were receiving about 100 emails a day only for this project. Finally, we also had to face a wave of unsolicited proposals and an army of lobbyists and pressures from all walks of life, whether to promote a peculiar sexual orientation, their own, or a political cause, or pop cultures, or images, or audiovisual material. There were lots of pressure to include audiovisual material, and we resisted to that pressure, or to promote even an internet company which produces erotic text on demand. So we were flooded with proposals of all kinds, and others wanted to include discussion of any work containing sexual scenes, and the project to become an encyclopedia of sexuality in literature, which would have amounted to invite entries on practically the whole of world literature. Let's only think of the dominant theme of adulterous affairs in Western literature, which is a major theme. So we had to sort all this out with the help of our team of advisors and make some difficult choices, as lines had to be constantly drawn. Finally, our first assigned entry came on February 2002, less than 2 years after we had signed our editor's contract, and it was on Swinburne by a scholar from Leeds. Then followed years of painstaking and sustained editing work, as you can easily imagine. This is just to give you an idea of some of the challenges we had to face. Personally, as probably many of you, many of my colleagues, I had the experience of editing a couple of volumes involving 10 people, 12 people, or 20 people with different egos and personalities and different attitude towards deadlines and text formats, with sometimes cultural differences interfering. But I soon discovered it was quite another challenge to deal with more than 400 persons from all over the continent. Now, let me address some aspects of the contents, as there are many discoveries and curiosities that the reader can find in these 2 volumes, even if you're familiar with this literature. I'll just point out a few elements, as I cannot go into the details, of course. Of all the 4 conceptual categories that we had, historical overviews, topics and themes, literary surveys, writers and works was obviously the most important category, and includes individual entries on authors and anonymous works which address their relation to the history of the genre as a whole and evaluate their contribution to it. Obviously, we have entries on well-known authors in the field. For instance, Bataille, Gombrowicz, Erika Young, D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller, Nabokov, Anais Nin, among others. Authors include also Ovid, Seiji Shonagon, a Japanese author from the 10th century, Aretino from Italy, Ihara Saikaku, an author from the 17th century Japan, and the main authors from the French 18th century, such as Crébillon, Restif de la Bretonne, Sade, 19th century classics such as Sacher Masoch, 20th century classics as well, such as Frank Harris, Pauline Réage, the famous French author, or Zoé Valdez from Cuba, René Depestre, the famous celebrated author from Haiti, and so on. One can also see presented in this volume all the major works in the genre, such as the Kama Sutra, this Indian erotic classic that set the tone for other sex manuals that had a great influence on erotic fiction. This encyclopedia also described the context of some classical works, such as The Perfumed Garden, an Arabic erotic manual by Sheikh al-Nafzawi. Other major works are presented, such as the Sanskrit Ramayana, Chinese religious works and their sexual rites, the Song of Songs, nunnery tales, and there are also many anonymous works or works for which authorship is uncertain, but which are very famous, such as the Chinese Jinping Mei, the French-Portuguese letters, and Fanny Hill. But also we can find works that are not well known, such as the Greek Anthology, with its 6,000 epigrams, that the scholar Pollard considers as one of the great books of Western literature. Also, this encyclopedia unearthed much lesser known authors, such as the Arab essayist Al-Jahiz, who was born in Basra in the 8th century, or the Iranian from the same century, Abu Nuwa, or Sanskrit poetry of the 9th century, or a Chinese novelist of the 17th century named Li Yu, or the 14th century Persian Rabelais, Obaidi Zakani, and so on. Some are celebrities in their own culture, but more or less unknown outside, as it's the case with the 20th century Turkish author Attila İlhan. On top of having a synthesis on major reflexive essays on the subject and another one on sexology, there are also articles on individual essayists such as Simone de Beauvoir, La Métrie, Gershon Legman, the famous unconventional scholar, Octavio Paz, William Reich, Deleuze, and so on. Under the friendly pressure of numerous contributors and advisors, we have included some famous writers that never specialized themselves in the erotic genre, but who have explicitly exploited sexuality in one work or another, or who have made sexuality an important component of their world vision, such as Boccaccio, Baudelaire, Duras, Flaubert, Garcia Marquez, Kawabata, Rob Grillet, Shakespeare. I have a beautiful entry on Shakespeare by Sarah Dees, who is a scholar here at USF. Maybe she's here. Solers, Stendhal, Twain, etc. These we even have an entry on Benjamin Franklin, who wrote what he called bagatelles in his spare time. So these authors gave a larger outlook on the theme of eroticism as an important part of mainstream literature. As far as literary surveys are concerned, they address genres or publication issues such as drama, Chinese sex manuals, bibliography, feminine magazines. This category allowed to cover aesthetic movements such as surrealism, which is so important for the evolution of sexuality in the 20th century, or the courageous role of some publishers such as Olympia Press, for instance, or to evoke specialized great libraries with their secrets, such as the private case at the British Library, or to address translation problems or the influence of rhetoric on the genre. This encyclopedia shows that all literary genres, major and minor, are used in erotic literature, from short story to lengthy saga such as the Victorian 4,000 pages sexual autobiography, My Secret Life. It goes from Sumerian love stories to American pulp fiction and to Japanese mangas, from the medieval French fabliaux to fairy tales, from memoirs to science fiction texts, from personal essays to treaties, from Blason du Corps, this French Hurley style of poetry, to the kabuki of Japan drama stage. There is an incredible variety of literary formats and style. At the same time, any reader interested in literary forms and originality would have his or her curiosity satisfied through innovative genres, like The Fou from ancient China, a sort of rhapsodic prose poem, the British Somatopias, which mixed geography to erotic figures, the Welsh Diffalw, that series of visual metaphors to represent sex, or the Persian tashbib, or a sort of idyllic erotic description, or the Ain Teni, a traditional form of poetry from Madagascar. As far as topics and themes are concerned, those articles focus on a predominant or a general subject in the field, such as libertinism, or a critical approach such as queer theory. The issues raised in the thematic surveys could suffice by themselves to give an idea of the topics that this literature is addressing. It goes from seduction or virginity to orgy, from aphrodisiacs to the history of orgasm, to anti-clericalism, from gay writing to mysticism and religion, from magic and sexual Chinese alchemy to exoticism, bestiality, monsters, to name a few. There are articles on taboos, transgression, insanity, metamorphosis, as well as on transvestite, venereal disease, and even on furniture, as used in literature as a narrative voice or as a means of expressing the level of passions. Because sometimes sofas and beds have lots to say about what's happening on their back. One entry examines the relationship between this literature and the notion of race. Another, the relation between religion and sexuality in this literature. Or another, the links between philosophy and eroticism in this body of works. And finally, the historical overviews present the erotic literature production within specific cultural and geographical perspective. For instance, Arabic literature from the Middle Ages to the 19th century. And the reader can thus compare Great Britain production with the huge French production of different centuries, but also Persian literature, as well as Czech, Russian, Brazilian, Catalan, Dutch, German, Irish, Japanese, Welsh, Jewish, Scandinavian, Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Ancient Egypt, Roman Empire, Ancient and Modern Greece. And this encyclopedia, on top of that, gives room as well to what I call minor literature, an important aspect for me personally. So we have entries on French-Canadian literature, Haitian literature, Romanian literature, Hungarian, Thai, Algerian, Tunisian, just to name a few. As for the general impression that one can get from browsing through these two volumes, well, we hope that the readers will find that many of the works discussed are of some, if not considerable, philosophical and socio-historical interest, conveying a wealth of information about the history and evolution of intimacy and the social mores, offering insights on censorship, on cultural differences, on fantasies, rights, hygiene manners, contraception, civilities, on the history of attitudes to the body, nudity and clothing, and many other medical and cultural practices. Many erotic works do project a utopian vision of the world, which they picture as liberated from all its current limitations, such as uncertainties, tediousness, fatigue. Characters are never fatigued, and that literature. Some other limitations include moral, physical, and material ones, or paranoia and fear of ill-intentioned people. But in doing so, they point out our fundamental human anxieties and the difficulties associated with such idealism. They raise important philosophical questions in relation to concept of freedom and the other. Although, of course, ostensibly bound to materialist views of the body, this literature sometimes succeeds to transcend it, reaching out to mythical, metaphysical, and spiritual dimensions, addressing issues of both life and death. And finally, it should become clear after browsing through our work that the aims of erotic literature can absolutely not be reduced to sexual arousal alone. Indeed, these texts are inspired by a multiplicity of objectives, social, political, and moral, embracing themes and forms that are just as diverse, if not more, as those of any other literary genre. The literary depiction of sexuality, as it is rendered in this encyclopedic enterprise, offers, we hope, interesting insights into every aspect of the human condition. And now to conclude, as you can As you can hopefully see with these few indications, this literature appears to be a bit more interesting than what the conventional academic views made us think of it. We may even think at times of the surprising and powerful educational dimensions it may have other than the one we have it traditionally confined to. That is a sexual education. As a real-life illustration, I would like to share with you a revealing testimony from a young Iranian woman that I've met at a lecture I've given in France some months ago on this subject. She told the attending public how she was lucky to have discovered mainstream literature through some erotic books that she found by chance in her father's home library. And in particular, she was moved by the erotic poetry of a woman writer, Faroukzad, whose works are now banned by the Islamic government and that circulate underground in Iran. The work of this forbidden Iranian female poet is, of course, discussed in our Encyclopedia, and she was very pleased to learn that. Thanks to erotic literature, who opened this young woman's eyes in a very unconventional way to a different world, a literary and poetic one, this young lady became a fan of world literature. So let's hope that this encyclopedia awakens in a similar fashion numerous potential readers worldwide, not only to this type of literature, of course, but through it to literature at large. I've had myself a great experience in teaching erotic literature in France and here at USF at graduate level at the students' request, and I was astonished to discover how interested they were in all the social, moral, philosophical, historical, and literary issues those texts are raising. Of course, they were interested in the sexuality as well, but all the other issues also were of importance to them. They developed their critical mind as their critical distance improved, and as did their immunity to the sometimes unfamiliar effects of these texts. So it can be a surprising pedagogical tool. Maybe some of these former students may even be in the audience. Well, I know there's one here at least, and maybe could share their experience with you. Well, I hope they didn't turn out perverts in the meantime. Well, I guess I would have heard about it. Personally, my own curiosity for this sector of literature followed quite an opposite path from this interesting Iranian woman, a more ordinary path, as it is my very familiarity with mainstream literature as a student that ultimately drove me to it, as it was notably censored absent from official history. This interest was arisen after reading three masterminds who transformed my way of thinking and the way of thinking of many scholars all over the world. The first one is Foucault, Michel Foucault, who recommended to pay special attention to minor or forgotten texts, those who were excluded from history, as these texts may shed new light on our reality. He would welcome defiant thinking, integrate error to mainstream for its illuminating influence, and look at what creates special problems to human consciousness as being of particular interest, and no doubt sexuality that does create problems to our consciousness. Hence the temptation for me to go through the back door of history into its margins and in the underground world to look at hidden treasures. The second one is Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, who for his part taught me the value of what he calls minor literatures, that is, small literatures produced by restricted groups and set in the margin of history, such as Quebec literature, very much alive literature today, and one of my fields of research here at USF. And small literature, as I've mentioned, are part of our encyclopedia. I've insisted on that. Finally, Roland Barthes was as accepted from 1974 to 1978 to be my dissertation director on this very subject, and he became my mentor after I had the invaluable chance to work closely with him just before his accidental death, which occurred in 1980. So thanks to his influence, I've dug into this field, thinking against the grain, and published extensively on the subject before getting involved in this recent endeavor. These thinkers have all in common a critical attitude of openness and inclusion, rather than exclusion. They have encouraged scholars, including myself, to develop an open mind, as an open mind is like an open window in winter. It lets the fresh air in. So the inspiring attitude that my models have embraced could actually be summarized in this wonderful quote by Mikhail Bakhtin: "Creative understanding continues creativity and multiplies the artistic wealth of humanity." I certainly hope that this attitude also transpires from this reference work, which seeks to bring this corpus into new light. Happy Valentine's Day. Thank you.
Time for questions and answers. Your questions, anybody? No questions? There we go. All right, we start with the differentiation between the words erotic and pornography. And a third term that seems to overlap with both seems to be romance. How did you term romance? Did you hear pornography?
The term romance comes from the medieval times and refers to those narratives written in French vernacular. It was called romance with a D at the end. It was derived from Latin, the language spoken by Romans, people by Romans. And when the word romance and the word romance, this word was applied to narratives in medieval times that were dealing with the adventures of knights and their lady of love, with courtly love, but they were related to love stories more than with sex stories. And so an encyclopedia of romance would be a completely different encyclopedia. As we have in the West more or less separated the two. There is this tradition that we call the art amatoria, the art of loving, the amorous discourse, which develops separately from the art erotica, the erotic discourse. They develop separately for different reasons in the West. We have not succeeded in the West to create a religion of sex like in the East they have succeeded to do, but we have succeeded in developing a religion of love. And love stories, most of the time, under the influence of Plato and Platonic love, which is of far more importance in the Western love, the Western hemisphere, developed separately from sex. Love was almost considered at odds with sex. But there is a different tradition. Actually, I'm teaching this semester a course on love stories, and there's not much sex involved in those stories. But it's a sentimental dimension, it's a feeling, the emotional dimension that is taking over. And
so then all of these so-called romance novels are loaded with sex,
I don't know about but maybe in the popular culture probably, yeah. It's just a euphemism.
Find the supermarket. Find a wall full of what they call romance novels.
I guess it's a convenient general term, yes, to regroup probably erotic text, pornography, as well as love stories, probably. Yeah. But I would have felt very dishonest to have called this encyclopedia romance, because that's not what it is. And especially we have sex manuals, essays, which are not romantic at all. They are dealing with the reflection, which reflexive dimension over erotic literature, over the practice of sex. That's a great question. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to bring some topics. For instance, a romance story such as The Princess of Clèves, which is a love story, a beautiful, classic love story, there. It can't be in there. it's a passion story. The rationality is over, but there's no sex involved. But there's a strong passion between a man and a woman. The woman is married, and she cannot overcome the fact.
What you're describing now does not describe the so-called romantic novels that went to
Well, maybe there is a snippet also in the English language. I think probably there is a contemporary snippet about the publishers or marketers that they want to attract the public to a more palatable type of text would deal with sex instead of calling pornography. Nobody would go there. You just call it romantic. This type of euphemism is constantly happening in our world. It reminds me of a doctor who would have to tell the health patient that he had to go through a surgery, and he would call it. He would not call it an operation or a surgery. He would call it an intervention. It's the same thing. except that it's an euphemism, and it seems to be more appealing. They go through all the time through changing meaning of words.
This person would like to speak to that question.
There's actually an interesting parallel between the way that the setup of a romance novel that's in a store like that is set up that will speak to how you answer the question, which is that the term is from medieval times, but one of the things that has happened in those romance novels that they actually have a formulaic approach to writing them that's based on medieval stock characters. So the way that the literature was written in medieval times was based on every person had a particular role within the novel. So there was like a general confinement of the character. And I took Dr. Brulotte's course on erotic fiction, and actually afterwards I was solicited to write romance novels. And I had gotten proposals to write them based on the medieval stock characters, and I said no to the company because the way that they formed them, the definition of the romance novel in the store is actually based on the medieval form. So that there actually is an equation for those books, so that the erotic element comes in or the sex comes into the book, but the actual definition of the literature has to do with how you spoke to it. So the book then really is sold based on that formulaic approach, and the sex comes into it, but the definition of a romance novel has to do with that medieval term. So it's interesting.
The way the sex comes in could easily define that book as pornography.
Well, right, and that's why they sell, of course. But the form of the literature is based on the medieval term.
How many people in here have read the modern romance novels? Don't be ashamed. We won't take names.
Everybody.
No, it's going to ask if the Encyclopedia covers cinematography and screenwriting.
No, just literature. We have to make hard choices. Otherwise, we have 10 volumes.
Sarah?
I just had a question. You said 400 authors contributed and over 600.
Yeah, at least.
And you edited every single one.
Well.
Yeah. And did you have any of your own contributions independently? I'm wondering what your area of expertise is.
Oh, I did my PhD in erotic literature from French. From the French perspective. Yes.
And yes.
That does not explain the fact that there is numerous French entries. What justifies that is, historically speaking, the French were much into this subject more than any other culture in the world. There is one scholar even talk about the French exception as far as this issue is concerned. They've created novels, romances, and many erotic literature from the 17th and 18th century are paramount forces in the development of the field. And there was censorship in France, but not as much in other countries, such as communist countries, totalitarian countries. So the tradition went on, very much alive in the 20th century, and it's very much alive today. So the French are very, very active in that.
that field. So they really dominate, they truly dominate the field.
Young man out there.
How do societies, especially the ones, I guess of today, we would consider them the Islamic countries, which have a deep history in the erotic novel, is there anything in the Encyclopedia that goes to how they modern cultures reconcile their past involvement in erotic literature?
That's a great question. It allows me to address an issue about which we are uncertain. There was an entry written by a scholar that I know, a Moroccan scholar, on the relationship between Islam and eroticism in Morocco. And it was a very controversial entry. It was criticizing the Islamic religion with its biblical censorship. And for some mysterious reason, we have accepted, John Phillips and I, we had accepted that article, and it was not published. And he was furious, because it's a friend of mine. He was furious at me, because he's teaching in Louisiana. He was furious at me. He said, well, what happened? That did you use my article to disappear? You censored it. I said, no, I didn't know. I didn't know. It was not published. I didn't pay attention to it, because, once we accept it, we trust that the publisher will obey what we are saying. Obviously, this article disappeared. So, was it censorship on the part of the editor, the publisher? Was it a clerical mistake, an error? We never know. We never know. And probably we thought that the publisher felt that it might be too controversial, might create controversies such as the Danish cartoon, and they didn't want that probably. But it was interesting from our point of view. Of course it was controversial, but at the same time it was interesting because it was giving the point of view from an Arab, from a Moroccan, who is also a Muslim, who is also from Islam. So it was not a point of view from outside. And so it was, to us, it was a very precious document and a well-written article, very well done, powerful, well done, they go through. And the irony is that I tried to publish it again. I felt so bad about this thing happening without our knowledge. I tried to publish it in Canada last fall when I was asked to write an article on the Encyclopedia, and so they asked me for an excerpt, but I proposed to them, well, instead of asking permission to reproduce an excerpt of the Encyclopedia, it doesn't make any sense, and it was in a French magazine. I proposed to them to publish this colleague, Serhan, please. And he said, yes, okay, well. And it passed through the committee, and the reading committee, they have approved it, and guess what? The first thing we knew when my article was published, the accompanying text was second censorship. There's something wrong somewhere. And I was furious for the second time. And there's nothing I can do about it because, it was too late, and I requested that they publish it on their internet site, which they didn't. Obviously, this time it was censorship attitude.
Any other questions? Provide.
Now we all want a copy of that, so.
Thank you.
Before you leave, I'd like to talk about a minute about the Humanities Institute event for next week. I'll give you just a little bit of background. Special Collection has a magnificent collection of medieval illuminated manuscripts. Medieval manuscripts which have been highlighted with color. Okay. Last year, the Humanities Institute and the Treasure Collections decided to have a symposium about it. So for the Friday, the library the Institute had nothing to do with this, had graduate students write papers about the illuminated manuscripts, and there was an all-day symposium. To open that symposium on a Thursday night, then the Institute brought in a speaker in order to give momentum to it. We are going to, it was very successful. We are going to have the second one on February 21st. The speaker will be on the 21st, and the symposium on the 22nd, which is the graduate student symposium. I wanted to do something a little bit different this year with the keynote speaker. So we got in touch with Dr. Thomas Berman, who teaches at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And he deals with Muslim influence in illuminated manuscripts. So Tom will be opening this symposium on February 21st. He is going to discuss medieval manuscripts and medieval Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations as seen in those manuscripts. This will be at 7 p.m. in Traditions Hall on Thursday, February 21st. Is that right, Mo?
Yes.
Okay. You're all invited. It's free, open to the public. Thank you.
So can I just add one thing?
Sure.
Last year, the graduate students, I just want to emphasize, came from Germany. They came from all over the country.
I didn't know that.
And it will be the case this time, too, that it is, in fact, and someone came from Toronto. It's an international graduate symposium. So just to do a little further promotion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can add that to the PR. Okay, I thank you very much for coming today, and I thank you very, very much our speakers. There's still some food I think left back there.